In this video, we're going to take a look at Colorverse number 39, Picnic Green. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. Here we have a well-behaved ink that shades really nicely and offers a bunch of tone variation depending by pen. And I do find all of the tones that it puts out to be very pleasant, and it becomes very much a matter of choosing the tone that you would prefer the most. Its shading is really consistent in it gives me exactly what I would hope for in a green ink. I've come to expect that green inks are going to shade very well as just a property of the dyes that goes into them. And this ink does not let me down with that at all. It has a really good amount of shading, as in lots of it, which really adds to the character of the writing. With that, I can see using this a whole lot. The only thing that I really do find when it comes to the Colorverse inks is they tend to be very expensive to get a hold of. So they're very much marketing, and if that marketing for you fits one of your likes in things, then it's really a good way to go. Like their space-themed inks for people very enamored with space and all things space is great, because half of what we really like in inks, I think, is their name and their connection to other things we like. So for that, I see this really being a great ink when it fits that niche that you want. And while they claim it's for the Opus 88, we all know that it's really for the TV show Supernatural. And I just don't see the color connection there. They didn't use green a whole lot in that show, but apparently the makers at Colorverse feel there should be more of it. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Noodler's Nib Creeper. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get a really nice dark tone with no feathering and no spreading. It shades so nice. It really gives the camouflage shading that I've used a bunch of times to describe green inks, really saying it's doing exactly what I would love for it to do. Now the medium is a little bit lighter than the fine, but this is a Japanese medium that writes a little drier. It's a lighter tone with no feather and no spread. The shading, though, is still really, really good and stands out well on the page. It's just a lighter in general tone. Now the stub is a little bit darker than the medium, but not quite as dark as that fine. The stub has no feather, no spread. It does shade well, not as much as the fine did, which was a little surprising to me. But I think the shading that's happening with the stub is almost like it's purposeful. So it really does make it look a little nicer in its performance as a shader. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get almost no ghosting and no bleeding. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Jinhao X750 with a fine nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a medium nib, a Lamy Safari with a 1.1 stub. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. It does shade, but the shading isn't standing out as much as it did on the Clairfontaine, which has to do with this being a bit more of an absorbent paper and the tone of this paper. Both of those are working against this ink, which still manages to put down some very nice shading. Now, the medium nib has a lighter tone than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It shades only a little bit. It's a light seasoning of it throughout the writing, but it is very regularly there. It stands out more at the end of the word like or at the end of the word veiled, but it certainly is there in the writing. Now, the stub nib has no feather, no spread. It is only a little bit darker than the medium in tone. It is shading some, but some of its shading you see in the dots of the eyes. You see it on the E at the end of made. You see it in N goes lighter to darker, which is very nice. I think this is a very pleasant general tone that's going on here, even though we're really not getting as much of the shading in the stub as I would have expected. Looking at the back of the page, we get a normal amount of ghosting with no bleeding. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, pretty good shading. I think the shading is coming across better on this paper than it did on the Leuchtterm. Really, always going to be a shock. I don't know that I get to stop mentioning that. The medium is only a little bit lighter than the fine with no feather, no spread. Still, the shading for this ink is strong enough that it is coming through on a toned, more absorbent paper. So I don't know if I can say much more to how well this ink is performing. It's doing a bang up job. The stub has no feather, no spread. It is giving some shading, but only a little bit, only the littlest bits throughout. Nothing really stand out. I don't think this is a great ink for a stub on this paper, just because you lose some of it. While you still have a great green, you don't get some of those qualities coming through in the ink that we would really hope for. Looking at the back of the page, we get a minimal amount of ghosting and no bleeding. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We get some shading that's going on. It is not too bad in what's happening here. It's not the kind of shading we've seen on other papers. And the tone of what we're getting is much lighter than we got on previous papers. This paper does have that tendency to really tone it back a little bit, make it a lighter tone than what we would normally get. Now the medium is just a tad bit lighter than the fine, with no feather, no spread. It still has moments of shading, but the medium hasn't been shading especially well, and it's not shading especially well here. We have a solid performing green tone that's easy on the eyes, but not really getting much for that shading. The stub nib is about the same tone as the fine. Now, it has no feathering, it has no spread. Yes, there are a couple of dark dots on there, like dots of eyes or the bottom of commas, but really we're not getting shading. We're getting a good, solid performing green ink. I think the tone for this is really good and really will help some of those notes look real good. Probably earn you an extra letter on your grade just for it looking so good. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting that's not too bad, and we get no bleeding that touches the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Blackstone Daintree Green. Here is Diamine Green Black. Here is KWZ Green Grass. Here is Pilot Bamboo Forest. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get a tiny bit of featherings. There's tiny feathers when you look at the TH of both. When you look at the T in it, it's really tiny. It's not like it's the biggest deal considering the quality of this paper. However, it is there. Now, we are not really getting any spread. There is a little bit of color variation. If you look at it in the top line, you see that the I starts a little lighter and it works its way much darker into the T. But even this shading, it's much more like you just have a darker green. The medium is a little bit lighter than the fine with no feathering, but it's a drier pen. No spread. It, I think, is shading a little bit nicer than the fine did. It's not standout and amazing, but it's definitely there. When you look at Francis, goes from darker to lighter to darker and lighter again. Not too bad. Or the goes from light to dark. Now, the stub nib is darker than the medium, but not as dark as the fine. It has tiny feathers, but livable. It has a little bit of spread, and it does have a couple moments of shading, but nothing that really is that stand out. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting that's going on, but none of this touched the page underneath, so no bleeding. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a black ink by Colorverse, Vortex Motion. Here is a red ink by Diamine, their Vermilion. Here is a yellow shimmering ink by Diamine, their Golden Sands. Here is a purple ink by Lamy, their Violet. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get feathering all over it, tiny feathers. In a couple areas, it makes it look a little bit blurry, like the beginning of Descartes, where it looks a little blurry. All of the word never. It gets some spread, which isn't horrible, but is present. It makes it more about a medium. It doesn't really shade, which we don't expect on this paper. The medium has the same amount of feathering as that fine did. It has the same amount of spread that that fine did. It has no shading whatsoever. The tone is almost exactly the same as the fine, so it's a very consistent performer as far as that's concerned. The stub nib has feathering, yes. Has spread, yes. Has shading, no. But again, this is something we expect and live with when we work with this paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see that nothing bled through and touched the page underneath, so that's always a bonus with this paper. We do get a normal amount of ghosting, which isn't itself a problem. I do notice that the medium, it's a Japanese medium that writes a little drier, had the least amount of ghost of all of them. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? For me, choosing a nib or pen for this ink is a tough one. Between looking at how it shows up with a wet fine or how it shows up with a medium flow stub. Now I know when you looked at the writing samples, you wouldn't have thought the stub was something that I liked. The shading wasn't especially stand out. But there was plenty of times when the shading showed up in, I'm going to call it a controlled, almost purposeful way, which made some of that writing look a bit better. So it's a matter of choosing between, would I prefer it to be darker and have shading that's really that camouflage in and out from a fine nib, or do I want a little lighter tone where the shading almost looks like you put it in on purpose yourself? That's the choice that you're making here. Now, to be fair, I do use fine nibs more than I use stubs. Thanks for watching.